The first thing I want to do is congratulate Claire and all the progressives in Oxford for what they've done to change the colour of this county. I know you like your blues in Oxford, but it's great to see the city and the county turn from blue to red to green to yellow, and to win, really important victories in places like Banbury, Henley and Tame, Didcot and Wantage and Witney and more. But I think the point is that winning office is never enough. You have to win power. And you have to do it as we live in these really turbulent, chaotic times. The madness of Trump, the horror of war, the uncertainty about our economy, climate chaos. Now, if only there was a kind of really simple device that could help us navigate these difficult times and get us to a good society, something that consistently pointed in the right direction and told us where to go. Now, I'm here to talk briefly about two recent Public Compass publications. Oh, there's an idea about something that could point us in the right direction and help us navigate these really turbulent, difficult times, a compass. So two Compass publications, After the Riots and Thin Ice. I don't know if we've got any copies of any of this stuff around, but if not, you can download it from the website. Let's start with After the Riots, which was published after, you can guess what events, which seemed like an awful long time ago now, doesn't it? It was last summer, the end of last summer when these things happened. And I wrote a kind of an analysis of what I thought was going on. And when I wrote it, I was really nervous, really, because it's very easy to have an analysis that says that this is all about bad people on the right, with their fake news, with their spreading of hatred, their organising, etc. And all of that is true. But it's much harder to look at yourselves and look at your own politics and look at what's happened over the last 20, 30, 40 years that has got us to this point. Because as I said in the piece, there's one very simple truth, that happy people in happy places don't riot and they're not racist. And if the progressive gamble is that given enough support, love and care, then most people will do the right things, which I think is what the belief of everyone in this room today, then surely that the opposite is the case. So riots are something that happens after decades of deindustrialization, when the kind of dignity and pride of work and places are replaced by, humiliating bullshit jobs or incapacity benefit. Riots are what happens when once proud and vibrant high streets are simply shut down and boarded up. They're what happens when there are kind of wave after wave of hostile change, austerity, then Brexit, then COVID, and now at very least austerity light, when people are already struggling. Riots are what happens when unelected and unaccountable Bank of England or the Office of Budget Responsibility decide how much money disabled people are going to get. Politics done to us by technocrats, not decided by us, by our politicians who are accountable to us. Riots are what happens when democracy doesn't work, when your vote is taken for granted and it's presumed that you have nowhere else to go and no one's going to listen to you and your vote never counts anyway. Riots are what happens when the state is remote and cold and everything works for the rich and the already powerful and not for you. And this is the difficult bit, I think. Riots happen not just when people are economically left behind, but when emotionally and culturally they are othered. When we look down on them and sneer at them and think that their decisions over issues like Brexit are just plain stupid. But when people are given an emergency button to hit for the first time in their life, and the first time in their life, their vote really counts, and it's really important, and it's going to change stuff, however mad you think that is, then we have to really listen to those people and understand what's happened to their lives, and why do they feel so alienated, and why do they want to do that kind of act? Because they are desperate, because they are scared, because we haven't looked after them to the extent that we should, because we don't understand their lives. We didn't even know that that was going to happen. We didn't feel it was possible. We weren't in touch with our country and our people. So I think all of that stuff makes us think, and we should empathise more and condemn less. Yes, of course, over those summer weekends when there were the riots. Of course there are people that are racist, and of course there are people who are thugs, and of course we have to deal with them. But the majority of people who are now voting for reform, a quarter of our fellow country people, most of those people aren't racist, they're not thugs, they're people who are lost, frustrated and resentful. And I think they have a right to be, and we should be thinking about why they're like that. So as the days warm up, as it is today, and the days get longer, I think there will be more riots. I predict a riot, because those people are still let down, still frustrated, still resentful. And they're particularly resentful because they were promised change last July and they haven't had it. So there's going to be more of this stuff. And all of this begs really difficult questions for us as progressives about nation and patriotism, about immigration and the pace of cultural change, about how we both face the future, but also we recognise the past, how we both modernise and conserve our country. What do we think about notions of class? How do we find the resources to invest in jobs and communities, public services and places that enrich our social soil and not just degrade it? How do we understand the causes of extremism without condoning it? How do we regulate social media? All this and more we have to work our way through. And that demands a politics that is both tolerant and curious, and people who are willing to say, I don't know, I'm not sure. People who want to negotiate a better future and not just impose it. Welcome to the world of Claire and Compass and the kind of politics that we try and promote, where we can be those kind of people and have those kind of conversations. So turning quickly to the other publication, Thin Ice, which was the work we did to analyse what happened last July, when Labour, of course, won really big, but the victory was wide but incredibly shallow. To our frustration in Compass, the election was all about kicking out the Tories, and we understand why that was. But we kept asking the questions, well, what then? What then? Right? And people didn't want to listen, and they didn't want to talk about that. It was just get the Tories out. But there was always going to be a kickback to that. There are no shortcuts in politics. You have to dig really deep, intellectually, culturally and organisationally, if you want to change the world. And we didn't see that stuff going on within Labour. And now we are where we are. From back to the election, we know the figures. Labour won 64% of the seats with only 34% of the vote. That isn't democracy, that's a farce. And in 131 seats, Labour's margin of victory was less than 5,000. A 6% swing across the board would see Labour lose its majority at the next election. Reform came second in 98 seats, most of those Labour. The Greens came second in 39 seats, again, most of those Labour. Turnout was below 60%. The scale of tactical voting was unprecedented, with 4 in 10 Labour voters expressing weak or tactical support for the party. In almost 100 seats, the vote of the winning candidate was less than 35%. Again, that is not democracy, that is a farce. It used to be 10 seats of that number. Our democracy is not fit for purpose anymore. And get this, in 202 seats, what we in Compass call regressive tragedies, seats where the combined Tory and Reform vote was bigger than the winning progressive candidate. So all that Nigel Farage and whoever's going to be the next leader of the leader at the next election for the Conservative Party, all they have to do is exactly the same deal that Keir Starmer and Ed Davey did at the last election. Stand a paper-thin candidate, don't put any resources, don't put any time, and 202 seats could go to the right, just like that. So easy to do, they could sweep the board. And now Labour, with no plan and no vision, has quickly stumbled into what we'd say is survive the day mode. Their poll ratings have fallen by around 10%, while Reform have gained more than 10%. And look at the polling situation now. On many opinion polls, there are 5 parties polling in double digits. And this is a system that is explicitly designed for 2 parties. You end up in absolute and complete electoral chaos in those positions, where very, very tiny movements of votes, from one party to another, lead to huge changes and swings in seats. It's completely unpredictable. Now, we don't know what's around the corner, and we know all the events and who's going to go up and who's going to go down. But that multi-party politics, I think, is here to stay, and our electoral system is not fit for purpose. So in all of that, where is the hope? Where does the hope lie? It lies in two places. Something that Compass calls the progressive majority, which Claire referred to, and what we call a kind of growing systems consciousness in civil society. In every election since 1979, bar 2015, there's been a progressive voting majority in this country that far outstrips the Tory vote. Just think, in 1979, Thatcherism would never have happened if progressives had worked together, and what a different kind of world we could be in now. There's a table that compares how left-wing electorates are across the board internationally. And the UK scores almost 60% in terms of support for left-leaning parties. We're more progressive than Canada, Iceland, France, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Australia. This is a progressive country with progressive people. But this progressive majority is not given voice by our electoral system. Not just because it divides progressives and sets us against each other, but because to win, every time Labour thinks it has to kind of pander to the people who control the agenda in a first-past-the-post system, the people who donate to political parties, the big media moguls, and a few swing voters in a few swing seats. So Labour to win and not agitate and not get those people opposed to them, their promise is always, we won't change anything very much. And then you get over the line, and then you're in a kind of doom loop spiral. I'm being interrupted by a bell, but quite right. I'm going to finish very quickly, so don't worry, I'll be easily within my time. So we're in that doom loop now, and we feel it with a government that didn't build up a vision, didn't have an organisation, hasn't got the culture, hasn't got the alliance, and we're feeling the pressures of that now. So to finish, there is another way. In the face of Farage and fascism, there has to be. It's to unite the progressive voices in this country, to work together and not against each other. It's to say that on key issues like proportional representation, taxes on wealth, and the regulation of the media and social media, that we agree on the fundamentals that will change our democracy and could change our economy, and we will work together and vote together to make change happen. The real power of Reform and Nigel Farage and people like them is that they tell people what they already know, that our economy and our democratic system is broken, that society is in decline. Theirs is an elite revolt from above. Ours is a popular revolt from below, a popular front that gives voice to the progressive majority of this country, and so gives voices to those in civil society and communities who know the system is broken, and the policies that they want in terms of environment, equality, civil liberties, and you name it, cannot be squeezed through a system that is so orthodox, centralising and controlling. This is the progressive majority to be mobilised inside and outside of Parliament. And you don't mobilise that progressive majority by pandering to reform, by trumpeting how pleased you are to have deported people, to keep on going about deregulation or to cut in the way benefits and services in the way they are. That isn't the way to do it. This is a reference for older people in the room. Why do you kind of buy Freddie and the Dreamers when you can have the Beatles? You can't win by trying to out-reform reform. You have to present an alternative to them. So Prime Minister Farage has stopped being a nightmare and now looks instead like a possibility. Doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome is always a side of madness that will simply deliver high office to the lowest people. We are not mad, but we are determined. Determined to present a vision of a better society, determined to deliver policies that will underpin it and alliances that will make it happen. We're Compass, and we know that the test of a true radical is to make hope possible, not despair convincing. I think our time is now. So let's get on and build the work of people here in Oxford and across the country to make our dream of a good society a living reality. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I want to begin by just saying a big thank you to the many Compass friends in the audience. As Neal referred to, last year's election was a triumph for progressivism in Oxfordshire, and I'm truly grateful to the many from other parties who lent their support to Liberal Democrats in my constituency of Bristol and Woodstock and helped me get over the line. So many thanks to you. I've been asked this afternoon to say a few words about the challenge of disinformation in our political system and the impacts that it has. It's a vast topic, and especially in the company of some of the other speakers, I do not lay claim to be an expert in it. So what I intend to do is to lay out two aspects of it that I have some knowledge and experience of, and then finish by posing some questions about how we address this pernicious challenge. Because disinformation is something that poisons our politics and infects society. Let's be clear, it's a deliberate strategy to erode trust and to cause breakdown in our democratic institutions. It's accompanied by narratives attacking the so-called elites, denigrating scientific method, contesting the legitimacy of courts and investigative journalism. This is designed to make people susceptible to false information. And it distorts the concept of free speech. Free speech goes from being, I'm entitled to express my views, to no one is entitled to challenge the selective basis of my views. So it undermines the whole idea that we should have rational contestation of ideas. So responding to this assault is really hard because it's a deliberate and concerted strategy. And it's clear that in this country, as in others, our democratic governments and democratic institutions are struggling with the challenge. However, we cannot leave it to the online companies who profit so significantly from the emotive impact of disinformation as other content to self-regulate. So what I'd like to do is discuss two areas of this. The first, foreign influence, and the second, the impact of online harassment towards candidates in political elections as dimensions of this challenge. There's many more we could have chosen, but I thought I would just focus on these two. And I speak about foreign influence partly in my role as the foreign affairs spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats, in which capacity I speak regularly in the Commons and with other politicians about the impact of hostile states towards our democracy. Back in 2020, the then Conservative government and the Intelligence and Security Committee commissioned the Russia report, which was an attempt to look at the impact of Russia on our democratic processes. As many of you will know, disappointingly, large portions of that report were redacted, so we couldn't see all of the information that the committee gathered. But what it was clear about was that there had been clear attempts at foreign influence in our democratic processes, both the Indy referendum in Scotland in 2014 and the Brexit referendum. And the report said, and I quote, "The UK is clearly a target for Russia's disinformation campaigns and political interference operations," end of quote. So this then leads to some concerns about who holds responsibility for challenging this. One of the aspects of that report was to look at the responsibility that the intelligence agencies feel they have. Now, all of us who know the history of democracies and the history in which democracies slide into autocracies worry when agencies of that type, who it is hard to scrutinise, take on a role explicitly in democracy. And what's really clear from the report is that the agencies are themselves struggling with that. It's pretty evident that they are self-limiting in their willingness to get involved in protecting democracy when it comes to the interference of foreign states. And yet who's left? If the agencies who have the capacity to monitor and track some of these things are not stepping into that space, it's left to agencies like the Department for Culture, Media and Sport or the Electoral Commission to do so. Now, there are very good people working in both of those institutions, but they are stretched, and they would not themselves claim to have the capacity to be tackling and monitoring the kinds of effective, targeted and subterfuge operations that the likes of Russia and others are undertaking. In 2023, the Conservative government put through the National Security Act, and they created a new offence of foreign interference. That was passed in July 2023. It was only on the 1st of April this year, so nearly 2 years later, that the now Labour government said that it was going to implement the Foreign Interference Registration Scheme, which was a key part of that legislation. And the purpose of that registration scheme is that any overseas actor in this country with the purpose of representing their country has to make that clear and register as a foreign actor in the country. If they do not do so and they're found to have been seeking to lobby for their country or indeed interfere in our politics in other ways, they have committed a criminal offence. That will only take effect now on the 1st of July. And within it, there are tiers. There's a standard tier and an enhanced tier. And as it stands, the government has only designated Russia and Iran as the enhanced tier, leaving China and other actors still at the standard level. So slowly, the government is starting to put in place some apparatus to address some of the challenges of disinformation. But it's not clear that that's fast enough, and it's not clear that it's keeping up with the threat that is posed. Labour government said in their manifesto last year that they would, on entering office, conduct a China audit, which would be intended to look at the operations of China in the UK and how China was impacting on UK interests. I and others are continuing to ask for the publication of that audit, which has not yet been forthcoming. And at the same time, partly in the context of the Trump administration, we see a steady flow of ministers to Beijing, and indeed the chief of the defense staff was there this week along with the trade minister, seeking to build bridges, build relationships with China, all the time not putting in front of the Parliament or the British public the government's assessment of the threat that China poses to us. So we have that on the security side, and then, as you know, we also have the Online Safety Act. When the Online Safety Act was introduced, foreign influence and interference was made a priority offence. So there's an attempt in that legislation around how people behave online to include aspects of the elements that were included in the National Security Act. My concern is that this framework is still fragile, that it is largely inadequate, and that to a high degree it puts too much responsibility in the hands of these social media companies rather than being bolder and braver to actually regulate effectively. Last piece of concern that I would share is that we've seen reports in the last 2 weeks as the UK government has scrambled to respond to the bullying behaviour from Donald Trump, that the government is prepared to put aspects of the Online Safety Act, and for that matter, the Digital Services Tax, on the table as things that they would be willing to remove in order to curry favour with Donald Trump and his technology backers. To me, that's a grave source of concern. I don't think we should be trading our tax policy and our regulatory policy, which is intended to protect the functioning of our democracy as well as our young people online, for the financial interests of the US, however challenging the trade environment might be. I am far from being any kind of expert in the algorithms that govern our social media. But I think even a layperson thinking about those algorithms can identify a few key elements which I think are germane to what we're talking about here. So first of all, the question of what is said. And I think those of us on the progressive side of politics struggle with this, because we come right to the heart of freedom of speech, which is such an important part of the democratic values that we are protecting. So on the one hand, we have an instinct to say people should be free to express views, subject, of course, to the legal definitions of incitement of hatred and other things that tip over into criminal offence. The next question there is, who sees it? So those who are publishing to these platforms have the opportunity to disseminate it, but as we all know, how far it reaches is largely governed by the algorithms. And those algorithms are locked and very carefully protected by the social media companies, principally with the objective of generating interactions and therefore revenue for themselves. So unless governments are willing to actually get stuck in to looking at those things, rather than simply calling for the self-regulation of the industry, there is a problem about our ability to understand who is seeing things. And then the final point is reach. So if we take somebody like Elon Musk may have set up the algorithms of X to ensure that his posts are put in front of us all. But he, in a way, doesn't need to, because he has so many followers that anybody interacting with that will in its own way stimulate the algorithm to put it in front of other people. So we have these three elements: what is said, who it reaches, and who it is said by. And they are all worthy of consideration when we think about the right balance of regulation in a free society. Second area I want to touch on slightly more briefly is the harassment and intimidation of candidates. So as somebody who stood in a national election for the first time last year, I was acutely aware of this threat. In fact, at the Blavatnik School of Government, where I was previously, supported by the Landecker Foundation, a team had done a great deal of work on this aspect, and I was familiar with their studies. The Electoral Commission published research that showed that in the May 24 local elections, 43% of candidates said that they had experienced abuse or intimidation, and 10% self-described this as serious. When they were given some examples of what abuse and intimidation might amount to, a further 13% said, actually, I did experience that. So we can say it's between 43 and 56%. That is very aligned to the figures they then derived from the general election, where 55% of candidates said that they'd experienced abuse or intimidation. And of those, 13% said that the form that took was serious. On a scale of 1 to 5, they rated it as either 4 or 5. So we can see that there is real interference in our political process by people using intimidation and harassment to intimidate candidates who are taking part in the democratic process. And that is happening in real life and online. But really troublingly, this is not uniform. It is targeted at particular groups within the candidacy. So women and those of minority ethnic background are much more likely to be targeted. 56% of women in the local election last year who were candidates said that they would not campaign alone because they were intimidated by the environment in which they were campaigning. That compares to 19% of men. And 47% of women said that they would avoid discussing controversial topics, which relates to 20% of men. So we have this issue. First of all, we need a thriving democracy in which people of all backgrounds, all genders, and all ethnicities feel able to stand. And yet people are being intimidated in this way and discouraged from standing. Secondly, those who stand are experiencing genuine distress as a result of the level of harassment they're receiving, which not only is an issue for them and their well-being, but also a further discouragement to those who might stand in the future. And finally, those who do stand, and even those who are elected, are self-censoring what they talk about because they're so scared about what the online and in real life reaction might be. And this is just not acceptable. For those of you who want to look into it more, the Joe Cox Foundation has done excellent work in this area. And as I said, there are publications from the Blavatnik School and the Alfred Landecker Foundation. So just to leave you, I think as we think about these challenging topics, there are three questions that resonate for me. First is, who should regulate democracy? Now that's a huge question, but when we think about the online space, who is it that holds the responsibility there? Is it Ofcom, which was originally set up effectively as an economic regulator of the media industry? Is it the Electoral Commission as an arm's-length body which reports into Parliament? But then you have the issue of who controls Parliament. So to Neal's point, I very much hope we won't be there. But if we had parties of a less progressive nature controlling Parliament, what could they do in the setting of the mandate to the Electoral Commission? And then the second question I'd want to ask is who defends democracy? I've already highlighted this question about the role of the agencies in looking at what's happening online. Are we comfortable with that? Do we have fears about that in terms of the secrecy that goes with those agencies? And is that a trade that we're willing to make? And finally, who should identify and regulate misinformation? You know, part of the disinformation approach that I described is contesting truth, is trying to challenge the heart of what truth looks like. And consequently, who we charge with assessing information is not a neutral question. But we need, I think, to get braver at confronting these questions and getting a bit more muscular about standing up for what an open and free democracy looks like and how we can regulate the information with that in an effective way so we can ensure the ongoing health of our democratic system. Thank you.
Hello everyone, today I'm going to be talking about some of the strategies of mis and disinformation that I have covered across online and social media across 3 different research projects. Sorry, is this better? Okay. So I'm going to cover some research that I've, 3 different research projects looking at mis and disinformation online. Now, the first project I conducted this with Professor Jack Grieve at the University of Birmingham, and we looked at Donald Trump's tweets. And we were interested in how Trump's communicative style varied over time. And so we collected his tweets from 2009 to 2018, as we did this study in 2018. And we analysed his style using a technique that I've developed called short text multidimensional analysis. I'm not going to go into detail of what that was, but it's aimed at uncovering the most common patterns of stylistic variation across his tweets. And it does that by uncovering common patterns of grammatical features. I analysed Trump's tweets from 2009 to 2018, looking at how his style varied over time. And I revealed 4 dimensions of stylistic variation. And this revealed that Trump's tweets varied in terms of how conversational they were, how much campaigning, the degree of campaigning they included, the degree of engagement, and how advisory they were. Now, I'm just going to focus on the engagement style, and this pattern revealed that Trump's tweets varied according to how much engagement they included. And so when his tweets were engaged, they not only interacted with other people, but they also acknowledged other people's ideas and opinions of others. But when Trump's tweets were disengaged, he often gave his own categorical judgments about other people and events and institutions and policies, but without marking that they are subjective opinions, instead stating them as if they're just matters of fact. And so this is kind of where we have this area of stating something as if it's a matter of fact, but it's actually just an opinion. This is kind of this nuance with misinformation. Now, in many of his disengaged tweets, Trump stated something to be unambiguously true, even though at the time the claims were not generally accepted as true. So this disengaged style is certainly used by Trump to strategically push an alternative narrative. So that was Trump's tweets. My next project was for my PhD research, which I looked at trolling tweets. And if any of you don't know what trolling is, I can explain that. It's essentially people online, essentially trying to provoke an argument or provoke a response from people, and they say a variety of different things. And I was interested in how trolling tweets, the functions of trolling tweets vary and compare to ordinary, just general tweets. And I uncovered 4 dimensions of functional linguistic variation. Now, I'm also just going to focus on one communicative function, and this is informational broadcasts. And this was the most common pattern of linguistic variation that I found when comparing trolling tweets and general tweets. And I found that there was a considerable overlap between them, so they often employed this communicative function. Now, tweets, when they were associated with this function, they had an informationally dense style. So they packed lots of nouns, noun types, noun modifiers, and just incorporated lots of information, sharing different kind of press reportage and broadcasting that information across the internet and across Twitter. And they were just commenting on news, but sharing a lot of news information. And it's not possible through my analysis to tell how truthful they were, but many of the tweets associated with the trolling ones were false and misleading, just based on what was known at the time. And so as from this analysis, we can say that this kind of communicative style is used by trolling tweets to spread misleading information. But as I said, this function was also used by ordinary tweets, just to share information, and often this was truthful information. And so what I think is that because this repertoire is commonly used to spread truthful information, it helps to make that false information that the trolling tweets are trying to spread, it helps to make that just a bit more believable, because it's in that expected form that we would expect to see truthful information. Now, the final project I will briefly speak about is my most recent project, and this was funded by the Leverhulme Trust, and I've been looking at some funny spaces on the internet, looking at websites that are known to promote pseudoscience and conspiracy theories. And I collected text from several known websites. I think I had 250 different websites. And I was looking specifically at texts on these websites that mentioned vaccination, climate change, genetically modified organisms, and stem cells, as these kind of spark a lot of anti-science. And then I explored common representations, common discourses for each topic. And then I was interested in not just in the individual topics, but I was interested in what is shared between the topics. Now, I'll just focus on one shared discourse, but if you want to ask me more about them, I can address these in the Q&A. But the discourse that's shared across all topics is the idea that we are being lied to. And this discourse occurred in texts in relation to climate change by suggesting that by focusing on debates within climatology. So there are areas in climate science where there are debates and there's not necessarily full agreement, but that was then used to kind of say there is no consensus on anthropogenic global warming and climate change, and so as a result, humans aren't making an impact on the climate. It was also used to say that the mainstream media their reports on climate change are sensationalistic and causing alarm, so we shouldn't believe that, we shouldn't do anything. It's not as bad as they're making it out to be. With regards to vaccines, we are being lied to was kind of demonstrated in many texts talking about infection and death rates, saying that they aren't as bad as they're making it out to be. They often say that the virus isn't that bad. It will actually make us strong through the natural antibodies that you make. They say that we're being lied to because vaccines are not safe or effective, and that they've caused various disorders and diseases, which we know that that's not true. With regards to stem cells, they talk about chemotherapy and radiation quite a lot, as they critique these therapies, as they say that it doesn't kill cancer stem cells, so they're pointless treatments, and we're being lied to just to kind of profit the big pharmaceutical companies. They also talk about stem cell therapy that's worked on an individual person to then say it definitely does work and it will work on everyone, and that we're being lied to, suggesting that it doesn't necessarily work on everyone. And then with regards to genetically modified organisms, they promote that GMOs are not safe and that we're being lied to that they are safe. And they specifically draw on particular companies like Monsanto to say that they've lied to us, and so they're still lying to us as well. Now, across all the shared discourses that I've found, we have, in my opinion, some very highly effective persuasive strategies. And these are downplaying and overstating the risks and the benefits. So, for instance, with regards to vaccines and viruses, the virus's risk is often downplayed as a way to suggest that we don't need the vaccines and that we don't need to have all these restrictions upon us, like lockdowns and social distancing and things like that. The risk of carbon dioxide is often downplayed, suggesting that we need it for life and that it's therefore we don't need to worry about kind of reducing it. And if we do reduce it, that would have an even bigger impact on kind of life forms. Just by calling climate activists alarmists and the media sensationalistic, that leads to this idea that it's not as bad as they're making it out to be, which is kind of downplaying the actual risk of climate change. And by saying that, they often downplay the benefit of conventional medicine to say that you should just take natural supplements and things like that, because they say that conventional medicine isn't aimed at curing you. With regards to overstating the benefits and the risks, the vaccine side effects are often overstated to say that it will cause something, it will lead to different disorders like autism, and when we know that there are obviously side effects for vaccines, but they say that these are much more severe than they are. The benefits of CO2, as I said, these are often overstated as a way to kind of promote climate inaction. The promise of stem cells is overstated despite limited research. They suggest that it works on one person, so it will work on everyone, and that's not the case. They often suggest that natural supplements will cure, treat and prevent all sorts of different ailments, and that is very much an overstatement. And they overstate that all GMOs are harmful. Now, what is the effect of these persuasive strategies? Well, I think the effect is the illusory truth effect, and this depicts that repeated information is often perceived as more truthful than new information. Now, something that's very important is that these anti-science websites, ones that promote pseudoscience and conspiracy theories, they repeat a lot. They are constantly repeating, recycling, regurgitating the same arguments over and over again across different websites, on the same websites over time. I mean, you could look back over time and find the same article just repeated over and over. It's just constant recycling and repeating. Now, I've uncovered through my research that not only is there lots of repetition across the different websites, but there's also these shared discourses that are repeated across topics. So the same idea that we are being lied to occurs for vaccines, occurs for stem cells, GMOs, and for climate change as well. And that just makes this all a bit more believable because they're hearing it again and again and again. So what are we up against? Well, I think we're up against three very highly effective and very persuasive strategies. The first is a simple strategy. The simple strategy is that they just make use of repetition, and repetition makes things much more easily believable. The second is that they pay homage to very subtle strategies. This downplaying and overstating isn't outright lying. They're not saying that climate change doesn't exist, but they're just saying that it's not as bad as they're making it out to be. And again, this makes it a lot more believable. And finally, the last strategy is a simulated strategy. By employing similar communicative styles and communicative functions as that people use in order to spread truthful and accurate information, this makes it a lot more difficult for the ordinary person to delineate fact from fiction. So simple, subtle and simulated strategies. And that's everything. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So I'm going to talk about defensive constitutional reform. I'm particularly interested in defensive constitutional reform in the UK, but I'm actually going to start by talking about the US because I'm afraid there are some important lessons for us. So if we just look at what's happening right now in the US, it's absolutely extraordinary. First of all, we have a regime which is taking a chainsaw both to US democracy and to the US social contract. So in terms of democracy, they're systematically removing checks and balances, ignoring court judgments, talking about activist judges, bringing in legislation to restrict the power of judges to review executive things. We can see that they are ignoring due process. People are being snatched off the streets and sent to El Salvador with no due process at all. That's an extraordinary thing to be happening. They're already restricting the freedom of academic research, and they're threatening those in the media who are attempting to hold them to account and to be critical. So all of those checks and balances are being very, very aggressively dismantled right as we speak. And what's happening to the social contract is equally scary. Doge was created, it's an unelected body, but with extraordinary power to dismember parts of the state apparatus. So, for example, they've already, to a large extent, erased black and female history from every federal rule, from military sites, etc. They have ceased funding to progressive organizations, including the Office of Domestic Climate Change Policy. They've abolished, or they're in the process of abolishing, the Department of Education. They're attacking Medicare and Medicaid. They're attacking benefits, including SNAP, supplementary nutrition, in other words, food vouchers for people who need food. They're banning books. They're weakening unions. In Florida, they are introducing legislation to liberalize child labor. So if that goes through, it will be legal for school children to be working overnight on the day before they go to school for up to 8 hours, and they won't even have the right to a break every 4 hours. This is, as the FT said, this is going back to the 1800s. Why are they doing all of this? Because if they can cut all of these costs, they're aiming for 5.3 trillion in tax cuts. And of course, the principal beneficiary of tax cuts will be the very wealthy. So it is absolutely shocking. And that's before we get on to all the things that are happening in terms of realigning geopolitics, aligning with Putin on Ukraine and on tariffs, threatening UK members with annexation of their territories. They've already withdrawn from the UNHCR. They've already ended funding for the World Health Organization. So these are truly unthinkable things. And of course, they abolished US aid. What I find scary is that the previous administration had a lot of warning about this. The Mueller report after the 2016 election said very clearly that there had been Russian interference. There's no question about that. Trump stacked the Supreme Court, and they then gave him presidential immunity. There's no question about that. That was obvious. There was an insurrection in January 2021. There's no question about that. That was obvious. Musk in 2022 bought Twitter and corrupted it. I think not even just for personal gain in the short-term sense, but actually, I think he lost money on the purchase, but he gained enormous political influence. And as you say, he was able to build up to 200 million followers. And of course, he made a 250 million donation to the Trump campaign. All of that was obvious. And what did the Biden administration do to protect US democracy? Well, they didn't really do anything to prevent foreign interference. They did nothing at all, as far as I can see, to control this industrial scale disinformation. They didn't make any restrictions on political donations, and there's not even any restriction on having criminals standing for high office in the United States. And of course, the result is there are a lot of criminals in very high office now. They also didn't put in any restrictions on what an incoming government would be able to do after an election should it win. So there's no restriction that says a government in the US cannot act against the interests of 99% of the population. There was no strengthening of the separation of powers, for example, the power of the courts to hold the executive to account, no strengthening of academic and press freedom, and no effective protection at all against abuse of presidential powers. Now, I'm sorry to have talked so much about the states, but the reason I wanted to do that is because I think there are some lessons for us. It's very, very plausible that exactly the same thing could happen here. We have a largely unwritten constitution which relies on what Lord Hennessy called the good chaps theory of government. And in practice, what that means is that we don't have any defensive measures in place. So pre-election, we have no control really over foreign interference. There's something maybe starting now. We have absolutely no control over this industrial scale of disinformation. We have no effective restriction. There are some restrictions on political donations, but they're not effective. And there are no restrictions on criminals standing for office. You can't, I think, stand as an MP if you're bankrupt, but otherwise, as far as I can see, there's no real restriction. And perhaps equally importantly, post-election, there's no control on what an incoming government could do if it manages to get itself elected. There's nothing to stop a government acting against the interests of 99% of the population. The separation of powers hasn't been strengthened, academic freedom isn't strengthened, and there's no protection against what 50 years ago Lord Hailsham warned us about. He used the phrase elective dictatorship, saying there's really no protection in the UK against us electing a prime minister who wants to act as a dictator. We've had 50 years of warning, we've done nothing. But we've also had a lot of recent practical warnings, just like the States. With Brexit, Callum mentioned the warnings that we had from the ISC about Russian interference, but we also know very well about the interference of organizations like Cambridge Analytica and Facebook conspiring to it wasn't just industrial scale disinformation, it was very, very sophisticated, targeted to the individual information. It was military grade psychological operations targeted at the individual. We had that warning, we know that, that's a fact. Johnson and Cummings systematically removed checks and balances. So we are now one of few countries in Europe that doesn't really have the right to peaceful protest. And we saw not very long ago, just a week or so ago, a Quaker meeting house, perhaps having a meeting rather like this one, was stormed by the police because they had reasonable suspicion that they might be planning some kind of disruptive protest. Well, that's pretty scary, actually. So they removed that one. They removed that right of peaceful protest. They purged the civil service. They introduced a judicial review bill in an attempt to restrict the power of judicial review. They want to reduce the power of whistleblowers. And they even went so far as proroguing, it was reversed, but they did go so far as proroguing Parliament to stop parliamentary scrutiny of what they were up to. All of that is fact. We know this. We know that Musk is now currently using his account to attack the government, to say that civil war in Europe and in the UK is inevitable, etc. We know that he offered $100 million to Farage. We also know that there's a group called Resolute 1850, which is seeking US funding for Farage. They've already pledged him $1 million. Well, we don't know exactly what's going on with his funding, but we know somebody's funding him now because his net worth is estimated at around $4 million, which is quite good, but it's not enough to enable you to spend £150,000 every month on Facebook advertisements. That dwarfs the combined spending of all the other parties in the UK. Somebody is funding him lavishly right now. So we've had the warnings. And although it's very clear, I think, that the world and the UK has many people who are not good chaps, our government currently seems to think and has said that constitutional matters are more of an issue for the second term. So 99%, we set up a project on defensive constitutional reform to try to prevent what is happening today in the United States from happening in the UK in 4 years' time. We don't believe that a second term is a foregone conclusion. If you look at history, you would say it's kind of a foregone conclusion because it's very, very rare that anybody would lose a majority of this size. But as the Compass report, the Thin Ice report points out, this is a very different kind of majority, and the world is just very, very different in general. So we think that there's actually something like a 40% chance of a very far-right party winning the next election. And so there's a very significant chance of, after the next election, something like Project 2025 being implemented here. We're effectively, by not acting, we're effectively playing Russian roulette with British democracy and the British social contract. But we're playing Russian roulette with two loaded chambers. That is not something, that is not a risk that any sane person would want to take. So we, in conjunction with several other organisations, are trying to raise awareness in government and outside of those risks. We can still act. There's still time to act. We could put in place protections before an election. We could control dark money in politics. That wouldn't be too difficult, and the government is actually thinking a bit about that. We could put in control over disinformation. As we've heard, that one is much more difficult, but it is absolutely vital. If you lose the idea of truth, you really are going to lose the idea of democracy. You can strengthen campaign fraud investigation and penalties, and you could disbar parties if they're egregiously breaching the rules. At the moment, the Electoral Commission has the power to fine them £20,000 or something. Well, if they've got somebody whose net worth is 200 billion backing them, they're not going to be unduly put off by that. You could reform the voting system. And it's not really a constitutional reform, but very, very importantly, you could make sure you're delivering on the promise of national renewal. When we estimated the probability of a far-right government, we looked at the sensitivities. Quite a big sensitivity is whether, at the time of the election, this government is perceived to have delivered. And if it isn't, the probability of a far-right government goes up a long way. And they should be putting in constitutional safeguards after an election, increasing the separation of powers, undoing some of the things that Cummings was working on, constitutional protection, requiring a supermajority to overturn them, to make sure that we have an independent judiciary, independent civil service, independent academic research, and independence of regulators, in particular the Electoral Commission. So there are things that can be done. We need to get the government to do them as a matter of urgency. Second term may be an illusion. It needs to happen now. It needs to happen well before a campaign starts. So this is, if anything is urgent, this is urgent. So if you're not already members of 99%, please do join us. It's an all-volunteer organisation, so it doesn't cost anything to join, but we do ask people to help by spreading the message and by getting involved in these projects that we run. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Compass, for organising the event today. And I just wanted to start by saying my commiserations to Isabel. The thought of having to analyse Donald Trump's tweets and then look at 250 conspiracy websites, the mind boggles of the impact that has on someone. So commiserations. What I'm going to say probably follows on fairly neatly from what Mark was talking about in terms of some measures which I think the government can take very soon. Particularly around the elections bill, which they are promising will be with us, probably a white paper or a statement before the summer recess, and then sometime in the next session, not quite sure when that's going to be, but an elections bill in the next session. But before coming on to that, I suppose I wanted to ask you the question whether you think there is a crisis in terms of democratic engagement. And I think what Neal was saying at the beginning, I think reinforces that point, and I think some nods in the audience do as well. And if you look at some of the most recent statistics, so the fact that the general election turnout 60%, a very low turnout for a general election. If you look at the fact that there are 8 million people who are eligible to vote in UK elections but are not actually on the electoral register, I think that's also a significant sign of disengagement. If some of you may have seen that report from Channel 4, 52% of 13 to 27-year-olds believe that the country needs a strong man. I guess it probably would be a strong man, and someone who doesn't need to worry about Parliament. Now, if 52% of 13 to 27-year-olds think that, I think that is also a very significant sign of disengagement. And regrettably, there are many other statistics of this nature. So 16 to 17-year-olds, so attainers, so people who are going to go on the register to be there so they can vote when they're 18. In 2015, 45% of 16 to 17-year-olds were registered so they could vote when they reached 18. Now it's 16% by 2022. So I think across all of the statistics, there is very clearly an issue with engagement in politics, voting, representative democracy. So what can we do about this? So there are some very concrete things that the government can do, and some of them they've indicated they are going to do, and we will support them on that, and I know a lot of the other political parties will do as well. So it's very given that that will be in the election bill, and we very much welcome that. That's about, I think, boosting engagement, particularly if it's linked to decent education. Votes to 16, very much support that, and it will work as long as it is linked to decent citizenship education, so that 16-year-olds understand what it's about and why it's worth doing, why they don't perhaps want a strong man running the country as opposed to living in a democracy. Then there's automatic voter registration. So those 8 million people that I referred to who are not on the electoral register but are legitimate voters who could be voting. Automatic voter registration is the answer to that. Now the government are sort of a dance of the veils really in terms of whether they are going to do it or whether they're not going to do it. It's quite complicated, might be quite expensive. Maybe they'll do some really simple things. So the most obvious thing to do is to, when you apply for a passport or when you apply for a driving license, at that point, your data, and there are some privacy issues, your data is handed over to the electoral registration officer in the area your address is from, and then they put you on the electoral register automatically. So no longer filling in that form that comes around in October. Actually, you go on the register automatically unless that you are a vulnerable person, and in those circumstances you wouldn't be put on. Otherwise, you're put on automatically, and then you're able to take part in elections. And the benefit from that, or one of the benefits, or maybe perhaps for some people it might be a disbenefit, is that the political parties will start knocking on your door. Because I know, and I'm sure Callum knows, and other politicians know, that if there's a door and there's no name, you're not going to knock there. Why would you? You're not going to capture any data about them, so you won't know what their views are. But if they're on the electoral register now, those 8 million people, then politicians will be knocking on their door and trying to find out who they are and listen to their views. So I think that would improve, I think, engagement. Also, perhaps more controversial, extending voting rights to a wider range of group of people. Many organisations, including ours, support the idea that there are people who've lived in the UK for their whole lives. They might not be UK citizens or Commonwealth citizens, but they still, we think, should be entitled to vote. Now, so you get people on the register, and then you need ways of boosting voter engagement. A number of people, earlier speakers, have referred to the role that proportional representation could play to do that, because it means votes equal seats. And that is a pretty convincing argument, I would say, for most people, particularly if you have, in a series of elections, seen your vote not actually help to deliver a seat at all. And I still meet people who say, I've lived in this area for my whole life, and I've never yet actually voted for a candidate that I succeeded in getting elected. And with proportional representation, they would do that. the citizens' assemblies and the engaging people in the policy-making process, I think that would be a way of boosting voter engagement. If people feel that the opportunity to express a view isn't just once every 4 or 5 years in the ballot box, but actually there are opportunities either at a national level or at a local level, and many authorities, including Oxford, are doing this, of engaging people in citizen assemblies so they are participating, active participants in decisions that affect them. I think that's another way of boosting voter engagement. Big money in politics has been mentioned. If you want people to feel that their views are being heard, what you don't want is parties, and it's all across the board, the parties being funded mainly by donors who are donating £100,000 or more. And whatever a politician says, that donor is getting something for their money. What they're getting at the very least is that when a donor who has donated £100,000 or more calls or emails and says, I want to speak to the Member of Parliament, they're going to get that access. Far easier than the person who hasn't donated £100,000. So it does have influence, whatever anyone says. So by taking big money out of politics, capping the amount that can be donated, actually what that will force the parties to do, and in Canada's a good example of this, they then have to go and talk to and attract far more members to their party and therefore far more smaller donors. So you break the stranglehold in some respects that those really big donors have on political parties. And perhaps the final thing to mention is just the issue of tackling the lack of trust in politicians. And I think this was an area where we were expecting fairly immediate action from the new government. Some of you will have heard this idea that the government were going to introduce an Ethics and Integrity Commission. It was talked about a lot in opposition, but I don't know where it's gone. I haven't heard anything about the Ethics and Integrity Commission really for the last 6 months. I hope it will happen. And if that Ethics and Integrity Commission had been in place 6 months ago, it's possible that some of the stories we are still seeing about ministers taking freebies wouldn't be in the news. Now, sometimes when my organisation runs campaigns around this, I'm attacked for freebies, that's a silly issue, it doesn't really matter, it's not big, it's not sort of geopolitics. But unfortunately, the public do actually worry about it, and it adds to their feeling of mistrust in politicians if they see someone, for the sake of argument, the Chancellor, taking a series of freebies which other people would never have the opportunity to have offered to them and couldn't afford to pay for them themselves. So I think I will just conclude by saying that the things that I've outlined, I think separately, none of these, I think, would ensure that our democracy was safe from the sort of onslaught that we've seen American democracy undergo under Trump and his supporters. But I think if we took them all together, then I think they would have a real impact in terms of building the resilience of our democracy. And I look forward to what's going to come after, I think, in the workshops, where maybe we will agree to work on some of these things and make sure they are delivered for the benefit of our democracy. Thank you.
Well, many thanks to Tom and to our entire panel. I think they all deserve another round of applause.